Welcome, everybody. I just want to, first of all, introduce myself. My name is Avriel Epps-Darling. I'm going to be moderating today's chat with Mike Smith and James Waldo, or Jim. I'll call him Jim probably. And I also want to welcome all of you from all over the world. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. So I first want to just explain a little bit about the course that we're going to be talking about today, and let you know that the first wave of the course, called Data Privacy and Technology, starts on October 20th, which means that applications are due October 11th, and the enrollment deadline to pay is October 14th. So if you're interested, now is definitely the time to sign up. It's important to know that there aren't any prerequisites for the course, and you'll likely be interested in this course if you're an IT professional, somebody in marketing, a decision maker, a privacy advocate, a policymaker, or anybody who's just interested in digital privacy in general. So with that, I just want to thank you again and remind you to apply by October 11th. So let's move on to the discussion. So thank you so much, Mike and Jim, for being here with us. I just wanted to start the conversation off by asking you, how did you become interested in privacy?
I'll go first if Jim would like me to.
Absolutely.
So I was trained as an engineer. I'm not a policy person. I didn't start my career interested in privacy. For me, it really became an interest as I was starting a software security company back around the end of the 1990s. We had a piece of technology that I thought could be used for much more than we were using it for in our own little backyard here at the university. So we started a company, spent a lot of time talking to companies and individuals out there about their security interests. And one of the things I found out was that, especially for companies, they understood the importance of security. They understood kind of what they needed to do, but they weren't really all that enthusiastic about doing a lot more in that space. Contrast that with privacy and the conversations that I had with companies and individuals in that space, especially as Jim and I were putting together our first course, which happened to be called Security and Privacy. And we found an area which people became extremely passionate about their personal information and the data that they had, who they were sharing it with, but they had really no idea what to do with the information. How could they better protect themselves? What kinds of decisions? It just became a so much more fruitful and interesting space that Jim and I now have continued to push in this area, offering courses, different kinds of courses in this space, having different kinds of conversations with people, looking at different issues throughout this space. So it's really, if you had told me, am I going to be doing this for the entire rest of my life? I would have said, what? That's not something. I kind of backed into it, but now it's unbelievably interesting and fruitful space.
And I tend to back into almost everything I do. So my academic training is as a philosopher. That's what I got my PhD in. But then I became a software engineer in industry, spent most of my life in industry doing large-scale distributed systems. And I was on a National Academy study of what would now be called the Internet Things. This was almost 25 years ago. But what happens when you have lots of embedded network sensors? And as part of the study, we realized that ubiquitous sensing was also a form of ubiquitous surveillance. And I insisted that we put something in the study about the privacy implications of ubiquitous sensing. And they thought that was a good idea, but that it actually deserved its own study. So I was then asked to chair a study on privacy in a networked world, which was an interesting thing because it was first put together just before 9/11 and had our first meeting just after 9/11. And of course, all of the attitudes towards privacy changed during that time. But after completing that study, I thought it would be an interesting subject to teach at Harvard inside the computer science program. So Mike and I got together to pull together a class on this. And I do remember the first class that we gave. Mike gave what's known at Harvard as the shopping lecture. This is the lecture where students decide whether or not they want to take the class. And he ended up by saying that privacy was going to be the most important problem in the intersection between technology and policy for the next decade. And as we were leaving class, I said, you know, Mike, that's a really good sales pitch, but I'm not sure it's ever going to get that important, which shows that he's smarter than I was, because it's actually become the defining problem in a lot of ways around technology for much more than the last decade.
Yeah, thank you. And I gotta say, I had thought about privacy a little bit just through going through various internal review board, like ethics review processes for little studies I had run before I got to my PhD program. But you both, taking a class with both of you, really just opened my world way up to all of these ideas. So now I feel like I am on board with what y'all are on board with. But before I took that class, not having taken it for, like, you know, the purpose of wanting to learn more about this, I can say it's like a really important part of my life now. So I think we should back up a little bit and just first define a couple of things. How would you define data privacy? What is it? And is it the same as cybersecurity? And if so, or if not, like, what does this course focus on?
So I'll start this time, and then we can tag team on this, Mike. So I think defining data privacy is actually one of the core questions that we raise in this course, because it's actually very, very difficult. It is related to data security, in that you have to have security around the data that you gather if you're going to keep that data private. But it's also interestingly different. And one of the questions that we grapple with in the course is, does data privacy have to do with the gathering of data, or does it have to do with the usage of that data? And I think it's unclear to people. There's been a lot of literature that has been spawned, especially in the legal area, trying to apply property laws to data to allow people to control their own data. But it's very hard to know what your own data is beyond sort of simple things like height and weight and things like that. Most interesting data is relational and has to do with how you interact with other entities in the world. So whose data it is might be, you know, half a dozen people or more. And the sort of purest case of this that we look at is DNA. Your DNA may in some sense be the most private thing, the most private piece of data that you have, but your DNA relates you to everyone that you are related to. And so is it their data as well as your data? So I think that's you know, what do we mean by privacy is a really open question that requires thought rather than just something that you can note down as the definition.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what Jim was saying. I think that's exactly right. Just to focus on the control aspects, right? So it is related to security, right? Because we do want to have some control. But what makes privacy, I think, so fundamentally interesting is it's not just building a wall and protecting our data, because in daily life, we're sharing some of our personal information with third parties that we don't have complete control over. It's not the same kind of relationship that we talk about when we're talking about security, that I have some data, Avriel, I want you to have access to it. I make sure that you're vetted. I understand but Jim can't have any access to it. But I may want to interact with Jim. I may want to get a product from Jim. I need to share some of my information. And then it gets into, well, now that I've shared, what are they doing with my information? How are they reusing that information? Are they selling it off? But I needed to have that interaction in the first place, but it's all those follow-on pieces. And how does that occur? And what legislation sits around it? What should we be doing? All these situations change as technology changes too, and we have new capabilities with which we can both gather that information and then do things with that information. It makes a fascinating perspectives that many of which we cover in this course.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that rings most true for me, is this idea that our personal data is being collected all the time in almost every aspect of our lives because of all the technology that we use. So could you guys give a couple more examples of the privacy concerns in the current like tech-led life and business environment that we all exist in?
Yeah, certainly. I'll start this time. We are using more and more of our more and more types of technology in our life to get both our private lives moved forward and our business lives moved forward. You know, if you have a device at home, a Siri-like device, a Google-like device that's listening to you, what's happening with that information, right? We're putting those devices into our lives because they make it easier for some pieces of our lives, but we're not exactly sure what's going on. I encourage people, one of the things that Jim and I did that got us into a lot of trouble with our first class that we put together was to encourage the students in our class to go out and just walk around campus and the neighboring neighborhoods, cities, count how many cameras they see. Were they at all aware of the number of ways that you are being watched in your life today? And then thinking through, well, what does that mean? Does that mean changes in the way that I'm going to be running my own life? What's happening with that information? Who else can see that information? Those are all questions that Jim and I were posing 20 years ago, which are still important today. And I think the number of different technologies in which you are being watched, you're being listened to, you're being snooped on, are all just expanding as we bring them into our lives ourselves.
When we first started teaching the class, one of the first questions we asked the students was how many of them would be willing to carry around a device that charted their location minute by minute. And nobody was willing to do that. Now, of course, everybody has a cell phone that does that without them thinking about it. The devices that we carry with us now are sensors that are networked that tell a huge amount about our life. And unless you think through the implications of carrying those things, you're giving away an observational mechanism that would have made George Orwell blush in terms of the kind of surveillance state we could have. And given how much we are now doing, especially after the last year and a half online, and the amount of data that can be gathered online on just anything that we do, if you're not thinking about your privacy, then you're becoming everybody else's product.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I took the course with you two at Harvard, we didn't do that little exercise that you talked about, but yesterday I was walking around my neighborhood and I just started counting how many Ring doorbell, or just doorbell cameras in general, not necessarily Ring ones, there were. And almost every single house had a camera just pointing it. So it was quite striking to me.
I still have these students doing that in my undergraduate class. They just finished last week, and the number of cameras is just increasing year over year.
I'm part of the problem. I have a doorbell camera too. So given that, this like kind of tension that we all, or at least us three, care about privacy, but also like the convenience of some of the devices that are compromising our privacy in ways. What does it mean exactly to be concerned about privacy?
So I think what we are trying to do in the online course, certainly, is to get people to think critically about the trade-offs they're making as they are using these online services and devices that gather more and more information about them, and think through everything from how the technology could be changed in such a way that we could minimize the data aggregation, to what kind of policies have to be passed either as law or regulation or norm to protect us from the misuse of that data. There are things that we really don't want people to be able to do with the data that is gathered. But the regulations and laws have lagged so much behind the advancement of the technology that it's very hard now to think of what the limits would be without changing the infrastructure that we've built up so far.
Yeah, and I like to think about this in addition to what Jim was just saying, in terms of if I'm leading a company that is necessarily bringing information in so that we can complete the transactions I'm having with our customers or those who are using our service, versus someone as an individual, just myself, in the interactions with these kinds of products and services. I think there are two different things that we need to think about when we think about what does it mean to be concerned with privacy. From the company side of the world, it's becoming obvious, I think, that you really need to think about the trust relationship that is being built between you and the things that you need to do with the data and your customers or those using your service. How can you make sure that they're never surprised, right? One of the biggest issues that we talk about in our class is what happens when you get surprised by something, right? That is not typically ending up in a good place. And from a company point of view, what can you do to make sure that your customers and your service providers are never surprised in a bad way? And that really, I think, comes down to building that relationship of trust, which most commercial entities want with those who interact with them. On the other hand, if I'm an individual, I really want to be thinking about my autonomy. You know, we talked about cameras. How does that change my behavior if I'm walking around town and I'm feeling like I'm being watched and I don't know who's doing the watching, right? That becomes a thing that I'm worried about. Same thing as Jim was mentioning online. When I'm doing things online and I'm making my purchases online, and I think I'm just briefly looking at something, and then it shows up 700 more times being flashed at me with an advertisement. You know, is this changing my behavior in a way that is beneficial or not? We give a lot more examples through some case studies. Probably one of the things we should be saying right now is the course is not put together as a sequence of, all right, here's this important concept that you should understand, but put together as a series of cases around important concepts. Let's get into the case. Let's understand the situation. Let's understand why the protagonists are making the decisions that they're making, and then think through, as Jim talked about, critically, what were the decisions made? Were they the right decisions? How has that affected the individuals in that case? What can we do differently in the future if we happen to be coming into one of those situations again? And Jim and I have found that that's a very powerful way to bring people to what the real issues are and have them oftentimes think through themselves. If I find myself in this situation, what can I do to do that? Got way off your question there, but those trust and autonomy, I think, are two things when we talk about privacy that are foremost.
Well, and I think it's important to understand that this is a class in how to grapple with problems, not a class that answers problems. We have the advantage of having been trained as a philosopher is I'm okay with asking questions that I can't answer. But you need to know how to think about these things. And that's the real critical thinking part that we try to stress in this. In each one of the situations, how do you go about pulling apart the case that we're looking at in particular, so that you can see what the important differences and the important similarities are with other cases, so that you can try to come to a conclusion that is right for the particular context that you're in. So in some senses, it's a technique class, not an answers class.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And sorry, just to add, and from the technology side, I mean, we're dealing with large, complex systems, right? It's easy to think about it, simple little camera on your door, but it's backed up by a huge system with lots of interactions, lots of people involved in it. That complex system and thinking through the ways, in addition to what Jim was saying, bring that philosophical perspective that is so important, but also bringing the large systems and how can these systems fail and not actually act in the way that you thought when you were designing them. These systems that we see out there, people are using them for things that we never imagined they would be used for in the first place. That's typically how we end up with a privacy violations, something we should. It's not that people built the system to begin with to violate people's privacy, but it ends up being used in ways that were never expected by the designers.
Yeah, so you both mentioned that the course has case studies, that there's a lot of critical thinking, not a lot of answers. So is it safe to say that the course will likely not give students like a checklist of things, the actions they have to take as soon as they're done with the course to protect their privacy or the privacy of their customers or constituents?
Well, I hope that our people who take our class will walk away and go, all right, I need to think through this, and here's some opportunities for me to do things differently. I do think Jim and I provide you with, here are things that you could do, but they need to be done in a way that's right for you personally. And so it's not an easy, simple checklist by any stretch of the imagination from that perspective. But there are techniques and tools that we provide to help you think through and grapple with the thorny questions that we raise in this class, though we don't know what the particular answer should be for you in this period of time for those who you're interacting with or the things that you want to get accomplished.
And I think there are some things that people will learn in the class that have immediate and straightforward application. But those tend to be the surface features. And there are deeper issues that we hope that people who take the class will walk away from the class and be thinking about those deeper issues and how their particular circumstance relates to those issues and how they can think about what to do in their case, not in the general case.
Yeah, context is really important in this area. So I guess I just want to dig into that a little bit more. What are some of the things that decision makers face when it comes to protecting people's privacy within their specific business or organizational context?
Well, so if you are offering a product, you really have to think hard about how much data you are gathering about the people who are your customers, how you store that data, and how long, for example, you keep that data. Retention policies are really important in terms of protecting privacy. And who you share the data with and how you tell your customers that you are sharing data with others, sometimes for good reason, sometimes for financial reason. Data has been declared to be the new oil. I'm not quite sure that's true, but it is a valuable commodity. And if you don't know how it's being traded by the people who are gathering it, then you really don't know what's happening to your personal privacy and autonomy.
One of the other things that we do with some of the case studies in our class too, which I think is important, is this space is changing rapidly, right? Both from a technology point of view, new technologies are coming out that will change the way people act and the kinds of information that we can gather, but also in the norms, right? What people expect and how they think about their lives. And many of the cases that we talk about, we're looking at from the perspective of there's no right answer from a regulation point of view. The law doesn't know what we should be doing in this space. And so we will often review and talk to the leaders of different companies that at that time, they were making decisions based on the information that they had with no understanding of where regulation, for example, was going to end up. How did they think through that process? What did they use? Where did they gather their information? What kinds of decisions they make? Jim and I like to say that there are no right answers in this class, but there are better defended ones.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm also curious, how was it transitioning this course from a residential course to an online one? Obviously, there were some technical challenges to doing that, but were there new audiences or resources or things like that that you had to consider?
Yeah, so this is one of my areas of interest too, is how can we better teach the materials that we have online so that the students truly are learning them. One of the fascinating things that's happened with everything bad about COVID is being thrust into remote learning and thinking through everything that we used to do in person, we're now doing through what we're doing right here, these Zoom kind of interactions and other kinds of interactions. But what Jim and I often benefited from in our class is to get students with different perspectives, different backgrounds talking to each other, right? Jim and I can be up there and tell you, this is what we think, this is what others have said. But we seem to get the information really learned better when the students are interacting with each other and bringing their own perspectives, arguing for why it is they think it is, listening to each other. That was fairly easy to do in our in-person classrooms. We'd throw students together and make them talk about thorny questions in interesting ways. How best to do that online? So one of the things that I hope the individuals that are listening to us today will experience is a lot of emphasis as we put this class together to make sure that the students are not only hearing from us and the protagonists that we bring in through the case studies, but talking with each other, learning from each other, hearing different perspectives on it. Only through those inputs of multiple different perspectives can you be better critical thinker, better prepared for the kinds of decisions that you're going to have to make in the future.
Yeah, for the last 4,000 years, the main way of teaching critical thinking was using the Socratic method, and often from somebody who was more expert at it than you. And what Mike and I realized when we took on this course was that we would not be there. So figuring out how to structure the course so that the students would be there to question each other was an integral part of the course design. And fortunately, both of us really take teaching, I think, pretty seriously, and looked at this as an opportunity to expand our palette of how we run our classes, both online and in person.
You're there in spirit, just not in texting. Great. I guess one of the final questions I have before we move on to some of the questions from the audience is just like, what led you to create this course, and why do you think the topic is important? And why do you think it was important to make it accessible to more people beyond Harvard's campus?
Well, so I think Mike was right when he said that privacy is one of the most important questions that we have in the interaction between technology and public policy. And we can, the reach that we have at Harvard is among students who may go on to do pretty significant and interesting things, but it's a pretty small number that we can reach in terms of absolute numbers. So the opportunity to try and find a way that we could expand the audience for the kind of thinking that we think is important around this subject was one that I don't think we could resist.
Yeah, and I'll add to that multiple different audiences. As much as I love teaching our students on campus, I've also gotten the taste for the ability to reach students that could, for whatever life circumstances, they can't come to our campus. They can't interact in us in the ways that we have traditionally done. And yet we have a topic that is both interesting to individuals who are, you know, as Jim was saying before, their data is being gathered day in and day out, as well as individuals who are actually producing these systems. And I'm very much hoping that we can get those two types of individuals together in our class to hear from each other, learn from each other. We'll end up with much better systems. We'll end up with better regulations. We'll end up with better laws through our outreach to not just try and keep this on our campus, but make this accessible to whoever, wherever, whenever.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much. So we've got a few questions that have come in from folks who are watching live right now. And one of the ones I want to surface is, as professors in computer science, engineering, and policy, what are some of the common misunderstandings you see when it comes to data privacy?
Oh my. Well, so one of the reasons that I started this course was to try to get technologists to understand how policy gets made, and for policymakers to understand the limitations of technology. And the example I often give is I went down to a hearing at the Federal Trade Commission. This was early on when we were just thinking about designing the course. And it was about the privacy implications of RFID tags. And I went down, and in the talk I gave, I pointed out that the inverse square law was your friend, because to activate the RFID tags took the square of the distance in terms of energy to activate the tags. And after I gave the talk, I had a couple of congressional aides come up to me and ask if they could find out more about this inverse square law, like when was it passed? And it made me realize that they had no idea that this was, this is physics. When I told them it had passed 14.5 billion years ago, they looked really confused. The policy people just didn't understand what the technology could and could not do. And because of that, they were doing exceptionally bad jobs of regulating the technology. In the same way, the technologists had a faith that everything would turn out okay, and didn't understand the policy implications. So bringing these two groups together and letting them see the viewpoint of the other and help educate the other was really a core part of what I've been trying to do now for 20 plus years.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating from a technology point of view. Often the questions being asked and the assumptions being made about a particular technology are wrong, right? Both directions. They're thinking that this technology right now is extremely dangerous and you can do X, Y, and Z with it, and you can't. On the other hand, they're looking and this technology is perfectly fine, and yet you can do very dangerous things, privacy things. So there's that whole thread that runs through our course that we have a lot of fun with. I think the other thing that we talk about too is just, it amazes me, continues to amaze me, how many people think that their personal information really isn't worth that much. And yet we have companies that are finding ways to monetize your information in unbelievable ways. And just having some of that information about how that process is actually happening, what takes place, where it is that my information is actually of value and how is it of value, is one of the things that we try to focus on, because I don't think enough people realize it.
Yeah. Eric, you asked a really interesting and I think important question, at least in my perspective. How are you addressing cross-cultural norms and concerns when addressing privacy, especially in light of technology developers who may not reside in the same space as the users or operators of the system?
Yeah, so our course does try, Jim and I live in the US. We understand the US laws and regulations and technologies better than we understand international, but this is an international issue, right? And I think Eric is exactly right. Norms are different around the world. Cultural norms are different around the world. We are sensitive to that. We try to talk about and bring in certainly the European perspective, some of the issues that take place in the Far East and so forth. And so we bring that into the class, but this is another place where I think having a diverse body of individuals taking our class, because they're going to understand the specific information so much better than we are. So we're trying to set up many of our activities so that the students themselves can bring in information and grapple with the higher questions that are true across country boundaries, but the specifics and how they're impacting people and what we should be doing differently is going to change across time and place. And again, we don't have all the answers for it. We're trying to set up so that people are sensitive to searching out and going after the answers for the situations in the context that they are most concerned with.
And this is one of the reasons that we don't have a checklist for what we're doing, is because the context often is country or even smaller locale dependent. So the notion of privacy in the European Union is very different than the notion of privacy in the United States. We do some talk in the course about, when you are looking at privacy regimes, you need to ask who is being protected and who are they being protected from and how are they being protected. And this varies wildly. And it's bad enough between the European Union and the United States, which actually have fairly similar privacy regimes. You get to places like India or China, and they have very, very different notions of privacy and who is protected and how. And yet, if you're a company building a product, you have to build a product that you want to have span all of these markets. So figuring out some way of dealing with this, and it often leads to absurdities that have to be grappled with. The internet by itself is not a geographic entity. It's a topological entity. And so you don't know which parts of the internet you're reaching other than maybe all of it. And walling off a part is not really feasible. So having to think through all of these things is something that's going to depend on the particular context you're in.
Yeah, and I know I tried to really champion adding in a lot of self-reflection and reflexivity and becoming explicit and thinking through one's own biases when going through the course. I think that's also an important part of making sure that whatever you're doing generalizes in your particular context. So we got a couple questions here, since you already brought up kind of this international focus, the difference between what's going on in different parts of the world. So a few questions here that relate to what like the EU is doing with GDPR, what's going on in California and Illinois. And so Scott Schoen asks, are the EU and its followers now in California and Illinois and other places dominating the debate and legal framework of personal privacy? Are there other players that are interesting that we'll talk about in the course? And I think a follow-up to that would be like, what are your views on the importance or the pitfalls of implementing data sovereignty initiatives by governments?
Well, so the California Privacy Act is something that we talk a lot about in the course. It's actually one of our case studies on how that came about. And it is certainly modeled on the EU's data privacy directives, GDPR and others. But these are evolving mechanisms even now. It's not like these laws get passed and everything's okay. Illinois is somewhat different in that they are talking about biometrics more than they are talking about data privacy. So it's a different form of data. Where things get really hard is when you move out of those jurisdictions that are particularly looking at particular regimes on data privacy to places like China and India, which are taking actions that are quite different, but actually internally consistent with a different notion of data privacy, which is not easily reconciled in the way that the California Consumer Privacy Act and the EU Privacy Acts are able to be reconciled. So we do talk about this. It's not clear that we give answers because it isn't clear to me yet that there are answers.
I don't have anything to add. Jim did a terrific job with that answer.
Great. I'm going to sprinkle in a little bit of drama here from a question that was asked Michael Riha, or Michal Riha, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and I apologize, but asks, do you see the increased willingness of today's generation, which I'm assuming he's talking about Gen Z, but maybe millennials, in comparison to baby boomers, to share their personal data as a risk to their personal lives and society as a whole? Are there generational differences when it comes to this topic?
So I certainly think there are generational differences. Where do you tie those generational differences to? Right. I come from a generation, I've been interested in technology for too many years. Right. But I don't look at sharing information online in the same way that my kids look at. My kids are now in their 20s, or the young children that I talk to. I'll talk to a student in my class who's typically 18 to 22, and they'll even tell me that there's a huge difference, generational difference, between what happened in their lives, right? They grew up, but at some point they were allowed to get a cell phone, for example, and start to interact with the rest of the world through this device. But the age at which they got the cell phone and the age at which their younger sibling got a cell phone are only separated by a couple of years. And yet the experience from the student that was in my class and what they relate to the experience and the ways that their younger sibling are sharing and having things happen to them are just vastly different. So it gives you a kind of a sense, the fact that things are changing rapidly in this space, and they are changing within a span of a couple of years. And it's fascinating to watch the legal process and the regulation process that Jim was just talking about obviously takes a long time. And what do we do in that space between the time of a technology existing, things happening, and the later, here's what we think the regulation should be, even if they're not perfect, and then we're going to adopt them later. That whole range of space is something that we cover in different types of cases in our class and talk through. But I think it just makes this topic one that is evergreen.
And the only thing I would add to that is often it is the shock of the new technology. The people in different generations are more used to it than the people in the older generations. But the shock sort of wears off after a while. 20 years ago when we started teaching this, nobody wanted their location known. Now everybody uses Google Maps to get around and to see what traffic is like, and that requires that that position information and velocity information is being gathered on a huge number of people so that they can do that. We don't find that particularly creepy, but we do find other things creepy. And this notion of creepy is actually important. It's an emotional reaction that people have to the technology, which indicates a disquietude that may then lead to thinking about how the technology should be limited or repurposed. And I think this is going to be this is only going to get worse. It has been getting worse. It's going to continue to get worse. We end the course with a couple of case studies talking about future technologies, which are either unbelievably creepy or unbelievably exciting, depending on what the trust relationships are going to be when they actually arise.
Yeah, and just to follow on with Jim's example for a second, I'm old enough to remember early technologies that said we can learn a lot more about traffic patterns and where things are going to go. And the early work in that space was all sensors built into our roads. A completely different issue with respect to privacy than, oh, by the way, everyone's carrying a cell phone today. Therefore, why don't we forget about trying to embed sensors into our roadway, which we'll have to update, and instead use people's cell phones, which they keep with them all the time. And we have a vastly different impact on privacy as you move from one of these technological solutions to another.
Totally. Great. Well, that's time. Are there any final thoughts that you all want to share before I wrap up?
So I'm tickled pink that we're able to make this course available to people around the world. And I am so much looking forward to seeing the kinds of interactions, comments, thoughts that appear on this, even though Jim and I will not be directly teaching the class to you live. We will be there to see where it goes and what takes place. I'm very interested to see the answers to the kinds of questions that we posed, because I think they will be vastly different than anything we've heard to this point.
Yeah, it's the ugly secret of teaching is that you learn more from your students than they learn from you. And I think that's going to be true even in an online course where we're not present. So I'm really looking forward to learning about what people's reactions are and what they think of these issues that we bring up in the course.
Yeah, likewise. So with that, I just want to remind everyone again that the first wave of the course, Data Privacy and Technology, starts October 20th. Applications are due October 11th, and you have to, the deadline for enrollment and paying for the course is October 14th. Once again, there are no prerequisites, and I'm really excited about this course as well. I think it's fabulous, and I really hope that everybody who's interested in this topic takes the opportunity to take the course. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you again, Mike and Jim, for your time and your expertise and brilliance as always. And make sure you apply by October 11th.
Thank you, Avriel, for making this very easy.
Yeah.
Thank you all who tuned in, and thank you, Avriel.
Have a good day, everyone. Take care.